In November of 2024, a 92-year-old man was arrested for crimes he was accused of committing in the 1960s when he would have been in his 30s. The 75-year-old victim was found raped and murdered in her home. But the question is, after 58 years, is this finally justice for Louisa Dunne?
Can you tell me how Louisa died?
No comment.
Did she die as a result of your actions?
No comment.
And if so, what were your actions?
No comment.
Was it an accident?
No comment.
Did you go in that house intending to kill her?
No comment.
So Louisa was found, as I said, lying on the floor in that same room, having been raped. She also had a scarf on her neck and a stocking. I think the scarf was underneath her neck, round the back, and the stocking over the top.
No.
Okay.
Hi everyone, welcome back to The Still of the Night. My name is Gemma and I'm so excited that you chose to come and join me today. Today we're going to be talking about an update. Now, about a month or so ago, I made an episode about Louisa Dunne. Now, Louisa was a 75-year-old woman who was found raped and murdered in her home in Bristol in 1967. Now, despite a huge police investigation, the case went cold until very recently when Avon and Somerset police did a review of Louisa's case, and thanks to modern forensic science, they got a match. And so in November of last year, 2024, Ryland Headley, who was 92 years of age, was arrested and charged for the rape and murder of Louisa. We're now 58 years since the murder took place, and the trial of Headley has just concluded. Right now, as I'm sitting here filming this, the jury are out considering their verdict. Hopefully, before I upload this video, we will have a verdict from them, and I will obviously add that in if we get that. So hopefully we'll have a full conclusion to this case. Now, when I made the previous episode, there really wasn't an awful lot of information about this case. I relied heavily when I was researching on newspaper articles from the time. And of course, just the way that we report on crimes was very, very different. So there wasn't a lot of detail. What we did know was that Louisa lived at 75 Britannia Road in Easton in Bristol. She lived alone. She was widowed twice. She was married first to Teddy Parker, who was a city alderman. He was heralded as a kind of an up-and-comer in local government, had a really, what seemed like, had a really promising career ahead of him, but sadly he passed. She then went on to marry a night watchman, and again, sadly, he passed several years before she was murdered. Now, the house that she lived in was a 2-bedroom terraced house. We know that Louisa had owned the house, but had sold it to Bristol Corporation, which we would think of now as, Bristol Council, and they were renting it back to her. We know that she needed help. She had home help that came in regularly to help with, just taking care of herself day to day. And that the Bristol Corporation were trying to get Louisa to move into a sheltered accommodation just so that she had access to more help and more support. On the 27th of June 1967, Louisa had been to visit a friend, Alice, in a nearby street. She stayed for a little while, they'd had food together, they'd chatted, and then at around 7:30 p.m, Louisa left for home, and that would be the last time that anybody would see Louisa alive. The following morning, on the 28th of June, a few neighbours were concerned about Louisa. They noticed that her downstairs, that the downstairs front window was wide open. But nobody had seen Louisa that morning, which was unusual. So one of her neighbours went, knocked on the door, got no answer, looked in through the window, and there she discovered Louisa's body on the floor. So the police launched a huge investigation, and one of the key pieces of evidence that they had was a palm print that was found on the open window. So the police were asking all males between the age of about 16 and 60 within a 1 mile radius of Louisa's home to provide their palm print for comparison. And they had thousands of men, thousands of different palm prints, and all of them had to be checked manually. But unfortunately, none of them came back as a match. Now, as time passed, no more leads came up and Louisa's case became cold. And so it wasn't until 2024 when Avon and Somerset Police reopened the case. They re-examined all of the old evidence, sent evidence off for forensic testing, and that came back with a match. And up until that point, or at the point that they arrested Ryland Headley anyway, that was all we were told, that they had forensic evidence suggesting that Headley was the killer. On Monday, the 16th of June, 2025, at Bristol Crown Court, Ryland Headley's trial began. The presiding judge was a Mr. Justice Sweeting, and the jury consisted of 8 men and 4 women. So now that the trial's taken place, we have a lot more detail about this case. So let's go back then, fill in some of the gaps, and let's talk about what we know about this case now. Now, the BBC reports that Louisa was a mother of 2. And when I originally researched this case, I couldn't find anything about her status, whether she had children or not. Now, the prosecutor for this case was Anna Viggers Casey, and in her opening she said, quote, "What we are talking about is the murder of an elderly and vulnerable lady in her own home. She was in no state to defend herself. Whether it happened 58 years ago or 58 days ago, the murder of any person is a matter of concern to the rest of us. The fact that time has passed doesn't make the killing of anyone any less significant," end quote. So some of the things that were confirmed in the trial then were that Louisa was born in May of 1892. So she was born when Queen Victoria was on the throne. And at the time of her murder, she was living alone at 75 Britannia Road, Easton in Bristol. Neighbours described how she was a local fixture, how she was known to stand on her doorstep and kind of just watch the world go by, say hello to people as they walked past, which is why when on the 28th of June 1967, several of her neighbours were concerned that they hadn't seen her on her doorstep. I'm sure that the neighbours were just concerned, she's an elderly lady, she needs help, just with general day-to-day things. They were probably concerned that maybe she'd had a fall or had taken ill. I doubt for a second that they dreamed that they were ever going to find what they found. On the second day of the trial, statements given to police at the time in 1967 were read out. The jury were told that these statements were being read because the witnesses were to be considered dead or presumed dead. The first statement was from Alice Clark, and now Alice was the lady who had been with Louisa the evening before. In her statement, she described Louisa as her best friend. She talked about how they'd spent the evening before, how Louisa had seemed in good spirits, and how Louisa left her house at around 7:30 p.m. One of Louisa's neighbours, Mrs. Violet Fortune, said in her statement that she'd gone to bed at about 11:45 p.m. on the evening of the 27th of June. She said, quote, "I was wakened suddenly by what sounded like a scream. It was not a long, piercing scream, but a crying out. It sounded muffled, and I thought it came from the street outside," end quote. So she looks out of her window, sees what's going on, can't see anybody, it's quiet, so she gets back into bed. She then describes how about 2 minutes later, she heard someone cry out again. She said, quote, "I could distinguish it was the voice of a woman. The cry lasted for 2 or 3 seconds, and I was aware at the same time of a voice. I cannot say if it was a man or a woman," end quote. She did go on to say that she didn't think that it came from Louisa's house. A second neighbour, a Mr. Harold Hodson, said, quote, "I heard a loud scream. It was a frightening scream. It was an adult woman. It sounded as if someone was being attacked. After the scream, there was a sound of moans, or as if the sound was being muffled, end quote. Just the idea, like just the way that they're describing it, knowing that, you know, those screams, let's face it, more likely than not, came from Louisa. It's just so, it just breaks my heart. So when Harold heard this screaming, he put it down to one of the other neighbours who was known to beat his wife, just beating up his wife. So when the sound stopped, he went back to sleep. So like we've spoken about, the following morning, neighbours noticed that Louisa hadn't been seen. They also noticed that her sash window was wide open. Now, in Louisa's house, like I've said, it was a 2-bedroomed terraced house, but Louisa was living only in the bottom half of the house. So she was using that front living room as her bedroom. So it would be incredibly unusual for her to have left the sash window wide open while she went to sleep at night, right? So they decided to go over. They knocked on the door, and now Violet Allen, she knocked on the door. There was no answer, so she went to look through the window. And it was when she looked through the window that she saw Louisa's leg on the floor. Assuming that Louisa needed help, Violet, with the help of some of the other female neighbours, climbed in through her window. She went over to Louisa, grabbed hold of her hand, and immediately realised that Louisa had died. She described her as feeling as cold as ice. Now, when Louisa was found, she was found on top of a pile of clothes on the floor. She was also found with her stockings and her underwear pulled down to her ankles. She was wearing a long blue skirt and 3 cardigans. At the time, Louisa was just 5 foot 3 inches tall and weighed less than 7 stone. The post-mortem confirmed that Louisa had died from asphyxiation by strangulation and through pressure to her mouth. She was found to have abrasions on her face. She was found to have bruises to the back of her head and down her right thigh. The pathologist determined that her killer's hand had been forcibly held across her mouth. He also discovered that she had a bruise along the back of her neck that he believed was caused by a scarf that had been tightly held around her neck. This scarf was found underneath her body. Swabs taken from Louisa's body also tested positive for semen. Now, obviously, at that time, we didn't have access to DNA testing like we do today. That didn't come in until the 1980s. But thankfully, those swabs were preserved and were able to be used when the cold case was re-examined. So let's talk about then key pieces of evidence in this case. So the police had the palm print from the window, and now they were also able to run tests on the semen. The prosecution called fingerprint expert Elizabeth Hobbs to testify about the handprint, and she told the court that she found 13 characteristics in agreement between the print found on the window of Louisa's home and Ryland Headley's palm print. She said that for her, that satisfied her enough that it was a positive match that the prints were the same. When the experts were checking these prints, they had the print that they knew to be from the window and then a load of random prints, one of which was Headley's. So the experts were going through each print, looking at different characteristics to see whether they were a match. Now, a second expert, Neville Williams, he originally concluded that none of the prints matched the samples, meaning they didn't match Headley's. Neville Williams concluded from this blind verification process that none of the prints matched the print found on the window, so he excluded Headley. However, when the two experts got together and discussed their findings, and Elizabeth Hobbs showed Neville Williams how she'd come to the conclusion that the prints matched, he went back and he re-examined the 2 prints. Mr. Williams said, quote, "She showed me where she'd found her first 2 matching characteristics, and it was then that I realised I'd been starting in a different area of the palm. Now that I had what I refer to as a jumping off point, I was able to make more points of comparison, find more ridge characteristics in a coincident sequence," end quote. So once he re-examined the palm prints, Mr. Williams found 19 characteristics between Headley's palm print and that found at the crime scene. He said, quote, "At which point I stopped my comparison work because I was confident in my evaluation that there was in fact an identification to the palm on the fingerprint form," end quote. Now, of course, if you're the defense, what's the first thing you're going to jump on? No. Your original finding was right, wasn't it? These don't match. Actually, the other expert got it wrong. She was incorrect, then they don't match. And that's exactly what the defense did in this case. However, a third expert was brought in. This third expert, I don't know the name, but they undertook the exact same exercise, and they also confirmed that they believed the prints matched. So moving on to the DNA evidence then. Samples of pubic hair and clothing from Louisa were sent for forensic DNA analysis by forensic scientist Andrew Parry. He said that he compared swabs taken from the evidence to swabs taken from the inside of Headley's cheek. Now, Mr. Parry talked about how he had conducted tests on the skirt that Louisa was found. He said, quote, "I understood there was semen on the vaginal swabs. If there was semen in the vagina, I would anticipate that semen could well have drained from the body onto the skirt, in particular onto the back of the skirt," end quote. So he focused his testing on the back area of Louisa's skirt and found further evidence of semen on the skirt. Mr. Parry went on to say, quote, "I checked the two samples and the profile of Mr. Headley matched the DNA profile from the sperm. If it's accepted that the sperm originated from Mr. Headley, then the findings are what we'd expect if Mr. Headley had been involved in some sexual activity with Louisa Dunne." Mr. Parry went on to confirm that the semen sample found on Louisa Dunne was 1 billion times more likely to have originated from Headley than an unknown person. So the prosecution have got a palm print that they say matches Headley, evidence of his DNA, both from Louisa's body and from her clothing. But then we go into the rounding off stuff. So was he in the area at the time? Like, what's he been up to? What kind of character is he? When the police looked into where Headley was living at the time, they found that he was living with his wife in Picton Street, Bristol. So he's in the right kind of area. I don't know, you're probably thinking, well, why was his palm print one of the ones that was originally taken? And if not, why not? Well, no, it wasn't. And the reason being that Picton Street is about 1.5 miles from Louisa's home. And the police's original search area, or the area that they were asking for men to provide their palm prints, was 1 mile, a 1 mile radius from Louisa's house. So he was just outside of that, which is so frustrating. The jury were also told about Headley's previous criminal convictions. They were told that in 1977, Headley admitted to raping 2 women. One of these women was aged 84 and one was aged 79. He admitted to raping these women about 10 years after Louisa's murder. Just after Louisa's murder, Headley and his wife and their family picked up and moved from Bristol to Suffolk, and it was in Suffolk that he carried out these rapes. His MO was to break into the homes of these elderly women who lived alone and to rape them. He used threats of violence with the 84-year-old, for example. He threatened to strangle her if she didn't comply. He told the 79-year-old that he had a gun and warned her that he would put a pillow over her face and smother her if she didn't do what he asked. When he was brought in for questioning in 1977 about one of these rapes, he voluntarily admitted to the other. And if you didn't think that sentencing in the UK was too lenient before, buckle in, because this made me so angry. So in 1977, he admits to raping these 2 elderly women, to breaking into their homes, causing them immeasurable amount of pain and fear. He pleads guilty, and he asks, when he's being sentenced, for an additional 10 offences of burglaries where his fingerprints were found to be taken into consideration. He was initially sentenced to life imprisonment, but following an appeal, this was reduced to a 7-year prison term. So that was in October of 1977, and in 1980, he is released from prison. So 3 years. 3 years for breaking into the homes of 2 innocent elderly women who should have just been going to bed like any other night, should have been safe within their own homes. He went in there, and he'd have been in his 40s when he committed these offences. Now, reading from witness statements taken at the time of these 2 rapes, the 84-year-old woman had told how she'd gone to bed, she was fast asleep, and she woke to Headley's hand over her mouth. And she said, quote, "Please go. Haven't you got a mother? Surely you wouldn't want to hurt an old lady of 84. End quote. With both of the women, he'd broken into the home through a window and, like I said before, had threatened violence if they didn't comply. A witness statement from the second victim, the 79-year-old, said that she was, quote, "stiff with fear, scared to death," end quote, when Headley had entered her room in the middle of the night. So she's fast asleep in bed. She wakes up to him there. She said, quote, "Leave me alone. Would you want anybody to do this to your mother or your sister?" End quote. It's just, it's heartbreaking that both of these women tried this same strategy, tried to make him see them as his mother or his sister, just as a human being. You know, would you want someone to do this to your family member? And obviously, in both cases, it didn't work. I hate that these 2 women would have spent the last few years of their lives in fear because of what Headley did to them. Now, the trial came to a close on Wednesday, the 25th of June, and both the prosecution and the defence gave their closing statements to the jury. Now, the prosecutor said, quote, "Mrs. Dunne's home was broken into by a man who had sex with her without her consent. He left her dead on the floor, strangled and suffocated. He was a man who lived locally at the time, but then uprooted his family and moved miles away. He no doubt thought he would live out his days without having to answer for what he did 58 years ago. But there is now, finally, a completion to the death certificate of Mrs. Dunne. No longer murder by person or persons unknown, but murdered and raped by Ryland Headley." Headley didn't take the stand in his trial, but his defence did say that he had no recollection of ever visiting Louisa's house or from engaging in a sexual act with her. The defence barrister said, quote, "He certainly didn't rape and he didn't kill her. This is a sad and tragic event that took place some 58 years ago. Mr. Headley was convicted of awful crimes in 1977. He pleaded guilty to them. He was being interviewed about one and he voluntarily confessed the other. He told police at the police station that he was responsible. Since that time, since he was released in about 1980, he hasn't been charged or convicted of any crimes until he was charged with these matters when some 44 years had gone past. Records and documents that could show where Mr. Headley was on that fateful night have long gone." End quote. Now, I understand that the defence's job is to defend their client, to put forward mitigating circumstances, to try and make things that look bad to the rest of us seem not that bad. But to suggest that because he pleaded guilty to those 2 previous rapes and he'd done it voluntarily, that is somehow makes it okay, is incredible. I saw a quote in another newspaper that I don't have on me, but it said something along the lines of that the barrister had described the 2 women that had been raped as being unscathed in the attacks, which is infuriating to hear someone describe these rapes of women. They're unscathed. Are you kidding me? The amount of just mental anguish that they didn't, even if they didn't have lasting scars on the outside of their bodies, they had to live the rest of their lives, what short lives they would have had left, with that trauma. It is wild. There is some body cam footage of Headley being arrested at his home in Suffolk in November of 2024, and I'm going to insert that here now.
Here today because I'm arresting you
Yeah,
on suspicion of the rape and murder
yeah,
of Louisa Dunne, which happened in Bristol in June 1967.
yeah,
The reason I'm arresting you
yeah,
is because the police have investigative material that indicates you are responsible for that rape and murder of
Yeah.
Mrs. Dunne,
yeah,
which happened at Britannia Road in Easton, Bristol, June 1967.
yeah,
You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned something that you later rely on in court.
yeah, yeah,
Anything you do say may be given in evidence.
yeah.
If you are listening to this as a podcast episode and you want to see this, the footage is over on the YouTube channel. So go and check out this video over there if you want to see what he looks like. But he really does look like a frail 92-year-old man. On Friday the 27th of June, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, convicting Headley of both the rape and murder of Louisa Dunne. On Monday, the 1st of July 2025, Ryland Headley was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. But I would love to know your thoughts on this. After 58 years, and with Headley being 92 years of age, is it really justice? Did Louisa get justice? Obviously, Headley will die in prison, but for the last 40-something years, he's been able to live his life freely. He's been able to have relationships, probably, enjoy his children, have friendships, go out and live his life. And he took that away from Louisa. I am glad that Louisa's family have some closure on this. After the court case, Louisa's granddaughter, who's now in her 70s, spoke of how when she was younger there was a rift between Louisa and her children. So she didn't really have a relationship with her grandma. In fact, she only remembers meeting her once when she was a teenager, but she does remember her grandma's murder when she was in her 20s. So what a shock that must have been to have the police knock on her door and say, we think we've got somebody, we think we've got somebody who murdered your grandmother. So I'm glad that her family have some kind of closure to this case now. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I hope that this has filled in some gaps if you watched the previous episode. And I hope that you will join me next time in the still of the night. Take care.